Devesher, a member of India's National Security Advisory Board and with the Vivekananda Foundation, which is a well-known think tank in Delhi, formerly with the Government of India, with the Cabinet Secretariat. And today we are talking about a book that he's written called Pashtuns, A Contested History. So viewers, if you could just, both Mr. Devesher and me, this is the digital release of his book called The Pashtuns, A Contested History, published by HarperCollins. But this is certainly not the first book Mr. Devesher has written. He's written a trilogy on Pakistan. And of course, many people in India believe that they're experts in Pakistan because of this very close relationship, very contested relationship. But let me just give you the names of the three books he's written on Pakistan, a trilogy as it were. Pakistan, the Balochistan Conundrum, Pakistan Courting the Abyss, and Pakistan at the Helm. And today we have, and I'm going to show this to you once again, the Pashtuns, A Contested History. And the Pashtuns, of course, are a tribe both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We'll talk about this. But Mr. Devesher, first of all, welcome to Softcover and welcome to The Print.
Thank you so much for having me, Jyoti. I'm delighted to be here.
So first of all, congratulations on the book. I mean, we all believe here in India that we know, that both Afghanistan and Pakistan are something which is very intimate to Indians. But sometimes I feel that actually we perhaps don't know enough. And your book really fills a void in our knowledge. And especially what I liked about this is that it's very much a reader-friendly sort of a book. It's not an academic, it's not aimed at an academic audience. And that I think is really interesting. So congratulations, first of all. And but let me ask you, this book, The Pashtuns, why did you, first of all, write about the Pashtuns? And why do you say that it's a contested history?
Yeah, it's, as I mentioned in the book, when I was growing up, I mean, all of us, we all read Rabindranath Tagore's Kabuliwala, a very benign thing. And then, Afghan Snow, which is India's first beauty cream, was named by Zahir Shah. So these are very friendly and benign images of the Pashtun. Then you had Ghaffar Khan, his close association with Gandhiji, the non-violent struggle for freedom. It's again a very peaceful, benign kind of an image.
But Ghaffar Khan was not Afghan. He was Pakistani, wasn't he?
He was a Pashtun.
Okay.
He was a Pashtun. So, because the book is about the Pashtuns, it's not about the Afghans. It's about, not about Afghanistan. It's about the Afghans, also called Pashtuns.
Mm-hmm.
So, but when I grew up in college, university, and started working, you had these immensely violent images coming out of Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion, the Mujahideen, the Civil War, and then the Taliban, and I just thought to myself, hey, what happened to the Pashtuns? And then you have Bollywood, which had also chipped in with a very friendly image of the Pathan, as they're called in India, who was a friend of the oppressed, especially of women, and a host of Indian actors who traced their ancestry back to the Pashtuns. So I wonder what went wrong with the Pashtuns. And I really wanted to do a book on them when I started writing, but I couldn't till so far. So then I decided, that's why I decided to write. And the title, yes, and I'm glad you find the subtitle intriguing, A Contested History. And the reason is that, throughout centuries when you read, this has been one land that has had the most amount of invasions than any other country or land in Asia, or perhaps even the world. Starting from the Aryans in the 2nd millennium BC, to the Greeks, to the Persians, to the Pashtuns, to the Mongols, to the Mughals, to the Turks, the Arabs, to the British, the Soviets, and the United States. They've seen it all.
Right.
Every one of these invaders tried to subdue and control the Pathans, the Pashtuns, but they found that they couldn't because they could not be defeated.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been contested throughout history. And if I can mention, coming most to contemporary times, in the 15th century, there was a seminal development in which three empires rose simultaneously. There were the Mughals in India, the Safavids in Persia, and the Uzbeks in Central Asia.
Right.
And this again became contested between them. For example, the Safavids had Herat, the Mughals had up to Khyber, Peshawar, the Uzbeks had Balkh, Maimana, north of the Hindu Kush. And this was stable for about 2 centuries. Kandahar changed hands between the Safavids and the Mughals. Herat was contested. Bazar was also contested. Then you had then became the British, the contestation between Russia and Britain in the Great Game during the 19th century. Then the contestation between the US and Soviet Union via the proxy of Pakistan in the 20th century. Then the War on Terror. So it has been contested throughout its history. And that's why the subtitle, A Contested History.
So who are you've told me why the book is called A Contested History, but who are the Pashtuns? Are they Afghans? Are they Pakistanis? I mean, you mentioned Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Frontier Gandhi, but like you said, he was Pakistani, but he was Pashtun. And then you have Zahir Shah, the former monarch, who is Afghan, but a Pashtun. Muhammad Dawood, the former Prime Minister of Afghanistan, Pashtun, but Afghan. So who are these people? Why are they so mixed up between two countries?
Yeah, so you need to get the terminology right. You see, the Persians referred to the Pashtuns as Afghan. In their literature as Afghana, Afghan. So they got the name Afghan. So Afghan and Pashtuns are interchangeable terms. In Pakistan, a lot of people still call themselves Afghan. In fact, in Pakistan, you record land records. You have land is owned by XYZ, son of so and so, Afghan, because it's interchangeable with Pashtun. So whether it is Pashtun, Pakhtun, Afghan, Pathan, there's a lot of terminology. I have used the word Pashtun throughout, which refers to the ethnic group of the Pashtuns. Now, till when Ahmad Shah Durrani founded the empire in 1747, it was a Pashtun empire, and it carried on till 1853, when the British, through the Durand Line, earlier after the Second Afghan War, the Treaty of Gandamak, it took portions of the then Afghan territory, and 1893 Durand Line split British India and Afghanistan due to spheres of influence, but gradually over a period of time, Britain absorbed it, and then Pakistan finally declared it as an international border. So the Pashtuns was split into two, into Pakistani area and in what was Afghanistan. Now, there are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. There are about 31 million Pashtuns in Pakistan, where they're the third largest majority after the Punjabis and the Sindhis. And you have about 14 or 15 million in Afghanistan, where they're about 40% of the population. Right. Largest ethnic group, but not a majority. So therefore, you have Pashtuns on both sides of the Durand. And that's part of the problem which I try to explain in the book. Then you ask, this is the terminology. Yeah. Now, who are the Pashtuns? Now, there is a lot of controversy, and which is not, historians still contest who are the Pashtuns. Whether they are Indo-Aryans. There is some who talk about the lost tribe of Israel. They're supposed to be one of the lost tribes. There's a lot of Turkic influence. So the overlayers and the invaders kept coming. People kept settling over there. But as far as the Pashtuns themselves are concerned, it's very interesting that their genealogies was written down. It was commissioned by Emperor Jahangir in 1613, and one scholar called Nehmatullah put down all the genealogies of the Pashtuns. As per that, the Pashtuns trace their ancestry to one common founder, Qais Abdul Rashid, who went to Saudi Arabia during the time of the Prophet, was converted to Islam by the Prophet, came back and spread the new religion. This is their belief. So all Pashtuns trace their ancestry to this person who was converted by the Prophet during the lifetime of the Prophet, and then had sons, grandsons, great-great-grandsons. So all the tribes emanate from this one person. He in turn had 3 sons and 1 adopted son, and all the tribes come from them. So that is where the Pashtuns are. It's a very ancient sort of a tribe, ancient ethnic group. So there are a lot of myths about it, but the Pashtuns believe that they have no pre-Islamic past, and everything begins from Qais Abdul Rashid.
Right, that's really fascinating. Have you been to these parts? Have you traveled in these parts, whether it's Peshawar in Pakistan or Afghanistan, southern Afghanistan, I imagine, which is where
over my long career I have.
Okay, that's so tell me, so Hamid Karzai, the former president of Afghanistan, he's Pashtun. The Taliban are Pashtun, aren't they? Mullah Omar was Pashtun. And so therefore a lot of the main protagonists in the Taliban government in Kabul today, they would be Pashtun?
Yeah. So, this is the tragedy of the Pashtuns, that those who are killing are Pashtuns, those who are being killed are Pashtuns, the refugees are Pashtuns. So that is the biggest tragedy of the Pashtuns. You mentioned two people, Mullah Omar and you mentioned Hamid Karzai. So Karzai comes from a tribe called the Duranis, who have been the royal tribe and they ruled Afghanistan for 200 years. Mullah Omar comes from the Hotki tribe of the Gilzai Confederation. And Duranis and Gilzais have had a long-standing rivalry throughout Pashtun history. The other big rivalry is between the Wazirs and the Masouds in Waziristan. So this is the tragedy of the Pashtuns that, because they have not been able to unite, and they're united only when threatened by a foreigner or by a foreign invader, or they went out on plundering expeditions. They've always been fighting amongst each other on some pretext or the other.
And yet you say in the book that after 9/11 and soon after 9/11, when the Americans then finally routed the Taliban from Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai met some of the Taliban leaders and they agreed that they would renounce violence. Mullah Omar, for example, you mention him in the book and you say they agreed to renounce violence and to have Karzai lead a new Afghanistan. So how did that come about?
You see, I think former President Karzai realized that you cannot totally isolate and exclude the Taliban from governance. Therefore, he was keen that to include them in the system of governance because they had offered to lay down their arms, give up politics, and so long as they were reintegrated back into society and they would stay away from any kind of political work. It was the Americans who, out of sheer hubris, because within a month the Taliban were defeated. So the Vice President Dick Cheney said the Taliban is over. So they had this sense of triumph and arrogance. Similarly, the former Pashtun commanders whom the Taliban had replaced, they were seeking revenge. The Northern Alliance of the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks, they wanted revenge. They didn't want the Taliban to come back. So both in the Bonn process and subsequently in the governance of Afghanistan, the Taliban were excluded. And these were the two fatal mistakes that led to the resurgence of the Taliban, because if you persecute them, and they were persecuted, they sought shelter in Pakistan and gave Pakistan an opportunity to plow these people back to forward their own agenda. So I think it was a huge mistake on the part of the Americans, of the part of the Northern Alliance, and of the leadership in Afghanistan on not being able to strike a deal with the defeated Taliban, bring them back into society and ensure that they didn't do any politics.
So Karzai was in favor of doing that. He wanted to integrate the Taliban into Afghan society.
Absolutely. And even later on, the whole peace process with the Taliban was started during his time. And it didn't come to fruition because by the time the Taliban had become strong enough and they insisted on having their own office, the Islamic Emirate, in Doha, in which others had nothing doing, So you cannot exclude the Afghan government from any negotiations with the Taliban. So he has been in favor of talking to, that's why he still continues to be in Kabul.
So, but that's an interesting point to make about why Karzai remains in Kabul. Let's just go back to 2001 a little bit, when the Americans defeat the Taliban and throw them out. But the question is that the previous 5 years, that is from 1996, when they took power, and that very well, that the manner in which they took power was so ugly. Najibullah, the previous president of Afghanistan, was hanged from the nearest lamppost near his house and he was pulled out. And then the subsequent 5 years of their rule in Afghanistan, the first incarnation, and you talk about that in your book as well, was a very harsh rule. So for Karzai to say, let me still integrate the Taliban into Afghan society, isn't that interesting? I mean, why would I trust the Taliban?
Because you're defanging them. Karzai realized that these people were still strong. They had roots. They were Pashtuns, especially coming from Kandahar and the south. They had roots. They had presence amongst the people. That if you don't get them back without their weapons, and they're agreeing not to enter into politics, they will continue to be a thorn in your side because Pakistan will use them. And this is precisely what happened. Now it's similar. You see, today's situation, the world is saying have an inclusive government. You are today telling the Taliban, you take people from the former government into your administration. And the Taliban are not saying it. What they mean is that you didn't take us. How do you expect us to take these guys?
Mm. So the Americans committed that their first fatal flaw in 2001 itself.
Yeah, I think in the Bonn process by not including the Taliban and subsequently not allowing people like Mutawakkil and all that who had come to talk peace by excluding them totally from the governing structures that were set up.
So what is the relationship between, I mean, I know I'm going back and forth, but what is the relationship between India and the Pashtuns?
No, we have civilizational contacts going back centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, when the first, I think a lot of Pashtuns who came, I mean, and you have right from the time of Mauryas in Mahabharata, you talk about Gandhari, you talk about Gandhari, which is Peshawar. You know, you have that kind of historical myth. Then the Mauryas, you have so many of Ashoka's Buddhist edicts in Afghanistan even today and in Peshawar. Whole lot of Buddhist influence that went from India into Afghanistan. So that's civilizational. But in more current times, the first lot of Pashtuns who came along with Ahmad Shah Durrani.
Mm-hmm.
They came and settled here. There were three, at least, Pashtun dynasties that ruled over Delhi in the Delhi Sultanate. There were the Lodhis, there were the Suris, and there were the Khiljis. The Khiljis, of course, came first. Then, during the British...
So the Khiljis are Pashtun?
Yes, Alauddin Khilji.
Again, a very cruel ruler.
I don't think so. Being charitable was a hallmark of the Delhi Sultanate during that time.
That's right.
But, so, and then you had, and when the British started moving up from Calcutta, you had a lot of the Pashtuns who joined the Rohillas, for example, or Rampur, for example, and they then dispersed all over northern India. So there is a large number of Pashtuns who owe their ancestry to Pashtuns even today in India. Bhopal, for example, or Tonk. These are the states which have. So there's a very strong Indian connection to the Pashtuns.
And that remains, do you think, with the present rulers of Afghanistan, the Taliban?
You have to look at it historically and civilizationally. Today, you have a different relationship with the Taliban because you closed your mission and you went out. But that is something which is at government-to-government level. The people-to-people and people who trace their ancestry to the Pashtuns who are there in India today, they have a different kind of a relationship. And I don't think so that people-to-people contact India has lost or will ever lose because the bonds are very strong.
So this Taliban, they are Pashtun?
Yeah.
Or they're primarily Pashtun at least?
Yeah. More than primarily. I mean, they're predominantly Pashtun.
And let's talk a little bit about the influence that, and so on the one hand, what's really fascinating for me is that on the one hand, you talk about this civilizational ties over centuries between India and the Pashtuns. Of course, the India-Pakistan separation happens only 75 years ago. But let's talk a little bit about the Pakistan's intelligence agencies, their military establishment. How did that influence, how did their influence over the Taliban, how did that manifest and how did it become so strong?
See, for that, I'll have to give you a background, so to give you some time to explain that. See, the central thread in Pakistan's attitude towards the Pashtuns and towards Afghanistan is their insecurity vis-a-vis the Durand Line. Right? And we can discuss the Durand Line subsequently, but here I just mentioned the insecurity.
Just briefly tell us about this insecurity.
So I think the Durand Line is a topic by itself. So let me just say, the insecurity that Pakistan feels, on the one hand, Afghan irredentism, because no Afghan government, not even the Taliban, have accepted the loss of Pashtun territories, which were taken over first by the Sikhs, by Maharaja Ranjit Singh when he captured Peshawar, inherited by the British and then passed on to Pakistan. No Afghan is accepted. They all feel that the border should be at Attock, at the Indus, and not at the Khyber Pass. They also
the Taliban also believe that.
Taliban also believe that. And there is Pashtun nationalism in Pakistan, which is articulated by Abdul Ghaffar Khan. He talked about the Pashtunistan option being there. Pakistan's worry is that if Pashtun ethnic nationalism ties up with Afghan irredentism, they'll stand to lose about 1/4 of Pakistan. So how do you prevent that? And they have used the deeply held religious sentiments of the Pashtuns to manipulate Pashtuns and to transform ethnic nationalism into a religious nationalism. And they did this first under Bhutto. When Muhammad Dawood had cracked down on the Islamists in Kabul, about few of them sought shelter in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And Bhutto started training them from about 74, 75 onwards, much before the Soviet invasion. When Zia came, he accelerated the program. And when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 79, it gave Zia a God-sent opportunity because the US realized this was one opportunity to hurt the Soviet Union. So they and Saudi Arabia pumped in large sums of money into Pakistan to set up madrasas, which would train the Afghan refugees to go and fight against the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And that is how the conservative Islamic influences of the Pashtuns became radical and got influenced by Wahhabi Islam. And for US, it was a tactical exercise to defeat the Soviets. But for Zia, it had a far greater salience because he made sure that the issue of the Durand Line would not be raised, or he hoped that the issue of the Durand Line would not be raised by any government in Kabul. In fact, Zia's attitude towards the Afghanistan and the jihad was not limited to defeating the Soviets. He wanted to establish Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in Kabul and set up a confederation of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and subsequently it spread this influence to Uzbekistan, to Tajikistan, to Turkey, to Iran. So he had a huge grandiose plan, what he wanted to do. Unfortunately for Pakistan, when the Soviets left, the Pashtuns didn't come back into power. Hekmatyar couldn't make it. And it was the Tajik, Ahmad Shah Massoud and Burhanuddin Rabbani who took over power, and there was a devastating civil war. Once Pakistan realized that Hekmatyar is not going to make it, they then focused on this new force that arose in Kandahar, the Taliban, led by Mullah Omar. Pakistan did not create the Taliban. They used the Taliban, which had emerged in response to a local situation. And then, through the Taliban, they made sure that Pashtun nationalism, which would not be an ethnic nationalism, but would become a totally religious. And that's how...
Sorry, go ahead. That's
how Pakistan managed to control and influence developments in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades.
But you're saying the Pakistanis did not create the Taliban.
Yeah.
But that's interesting.
But they used them. You see, as soon as this force arose, because of the local commanders in Kandahar who were brutalizing the people, they were raping women, which is the worst crime in the Pashtun culture. They were fighting over boys, and Kandahar itself was, up in arms. Then some people approached Mullah Omar, who was a Mujahid who had fought against the Soviets, but was living a very peaceful life in one of the small village mosques. He got together a band of 20 people, said, we must do something about this. And with very few weapons, they did it. They defeated the local commanders initially, gathered some strength, got weapons, got a little bit of money, and gradually increased. So within about 2 or 3 months, Nasirullah Babar, who was the interior minister, he, being a Pashtun himself, realized the potential of this group. And then there was this famous convoy that went from Pakistan. It was going all the way to Turkmenistan. And, all those things that happened. It's part of Taliban folklore now. And that's how Pakistan started capitalizing on it. They allowed them to take over Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's armory, through which they got a huge amount of weapons, and then gradually expanded their influence. So within about 6 months or so, from a band of about 20, 30 men, they had become 1,000, 2,000. And then what happens among the Pashtuns, that you smell success and everybody goes to that and they change sides. And this is exactly what happened with the Taliban, and Pakistan capitalized on this.
So just to go back a little bit, in December 1979, when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and then you say that Ziaul Haq, who was the martial law administrator of Pakistan, used that as an opportunity to expand Islamic influence across these parts, right? Afghanistan and beyond. But the Americans, didn't they see what was going on? Didn't they see through Zia's game?
This is interesting. For the US, the greater enemy was the Soviet Union. The destruction of the Soviet Union was their priority.
Yeah.
And in a very famous interview of the former national security advisor to a French magazine, I forget the name both of the NSA and the magazine, but he said, what do you think is more important to the world? Destruction of the Soviet Union or half-crazed mullahs go hanging around with guns.
Mm.
So for them, similarly, they knew that the Pakistan was developing nuclear weapons, but the priority was the Soviet Union. So they overlooked that. Till such time as that objective was met, then they turned around in Pakistan and had the Peshawar Amendment and they stopped aid and things like that. So the US is very focused on the primary target, which was defeat of the Soviet Union. They knew what Zia was doing and what his plans were. And you see, when you have these pan-Islamism, the whole term Mujahideen was made popular and acceptable in the West thanks to the US. Global jihad, and when the Arabs, Osama bin Laden came and they had these various charities, set up shop in Peshawar, and they spread Wahhabi influence through the camps and in the madrasas. The Americans are, of course, aware of all this. But they felt it was a good thing because the Soviets were being hit.
So the Pashtuns are a victim of this religious expansion.
Absolutely. Massive victim of the global jihad because it destroyed the social and tribal structure of the Pashtuns.
How did it
the
do
Pashtuns, there are two major institutions. One is called the Hujra and the other is the Masjid. The Hujra is like every house has a Hujra, which is like a courtyard or a room where you have charpais and people come and smoke the hookah and sit in the evening and discuss world affairs. The villages have a combined Hujra. The Hujra, which is the secular institution, has always dominated the Masjid. So they appointed the mullah in the Masjid. And if the mullah was going out of step or becoming too radical, they threw him out and appointed somebody else. The mullah was always dependent on the Hujra and the Pashtun maliks and the khans for his sustenance and livelihood. Now, when the jihad started, Saudi Arabia and the US pumped a large amount of money into the mullahs who became financially independent and they became leaders. Now, in the past in Pashtun history, whenever there has been an invasion, it is the mullah who is given call for jihad and everybody has followed them. They become very prominent mullahs. But once that was over, the mullah went back to his masjid and the maliks and the khans asserted leadership again. But here, because they had an independent source of income, thanks to US and Saudi funding, they came into their own. They became very prominent. And that's ultimately which led to the rise of the Taliban. So the entire social structure and tribal structure of the Pashtuns has been severely damaged. And you will not have peace back in the Pashtun areas till that balance is restored and the Hujra or the secular social leadership comes back into prominence and the mullah goes back to his traditional role. It's a very difficult task. It's very complex. But ultimately, that is the way forward. And this is how the Pashtuns have managed to survive for thousands of years.
Which is that they're able to change sides to protect themselves or to save themselves in a sense.
Yes, but that has always been a secular kind of a happening. It's not a religious happening, right? But now the religious leadership has started dominating because of the Wahhabi influence. And you have, all the Taliban leaders are mullahs, so-called mullahs. It's not that they have completed their religious education, but they've all adopted the title of mullah. Mullah Omar, Mullah Baradar, Mullah Yaqub, so it is the religious leadership that has come to down.
So they are mullah, they are Pashtun. They understand what the Pakistanis have done with the Pashtuns over the last 2 or 3 decades. So what is this relationship like between the Pashtuns or with this community, the Taliban or the senior Taliban figures and Pakistan?
It's uncomfortable. See, what Pakistan did not realize, what most people don't or tend to forget. An Afghan, a Pashtun is loyal only to himself or to his community or to his state. The Taliban in opposition were one. The Taliban in power are a totally different kettle of fish. So what Pakistan expected from the Taliban were 3 things. A, keep India away from Afghanistan. 2, accept the Durand Line, recognize the Durand Line. And 3rd, act against the TTP. Today, the Taliban have invited...
It is the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan.
Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan.
A terror group that the Pakistanis accuse are living in Afghanistan and carry out terror attacks in Pakistan. Yeah, go ahead.
They're actually, they're all Wazirs and Masoods. They are Masoods predominantly and in Pakistan. They may seek sanctuary and shelter temporarily, but they're very much sons of the soil in Pakistan.
Okay.
I'll come to that in a bit.
Yeah, sure.
Just to complete this train of thought.
Yeah.
The Taliban have now, after a year, invited India back into Kabul.
Yes.
They have not only refused to recognize the Durand Line, they have torn portions of the Durand Line, the fencing. And they have said this is an unresolved issue and the fence creates or divides brothers. That's a very worrying thing for Pakistan. And third, they have taken no action against the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan because they are, when the Taliban were in trouble, when they had to leave Afghanistan in 2001, it was the people in Waziristan who today are the TTP have given them refuge and shelter. Today, the TTP needs refuge and shelter, and there is no way that the Pashtun Taliban is going to ever act against them. They facilitated talks between Pakistan and the TTP, but that's the limit to which they will go. They will not defang the TTP, which is what Pakistan had wanted to do. So the relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan is extremely uncomfortable at the moment. If you recall, in 2021 August, there was euphoria in Pakistan. Imran Khan even said, the Pashtuns, Afghans have broken the shackles of slavery. India has lost 3 billion investment, and so on and so forth. Today, the mood is very, very different.
But is it because the Taliban who are Pashtun and they're rediscovering themselves and asserting themselves, or what is it about? The fact that they are in power, but what's the difference? After all, they have been subject to the Pakistani military establishment for so many decades.
Yeah, but they're Afghan nationalists first and foremost. See, the Russians miscalculated the same thing. It was a very famous statement when Dawood had gone to Moscow and Brezhnev told him that, you have got these advisors, American and French advisors in northern Afghanistan. I want you to throw them out because there is a security threat to the Soviet Union. And Dawood got up and said, we may be a poor country, but we will do what is best for Afghanistan. And he walked out of the meeting. And Brezhnev and the Soviets are totally shocked because they didn't realize, they didn't understand Pashtun culture, that they are first and foremost nationalists. Similarly, Pakistan is finding out now, even though they have so many Pashtuns there, they thought that these guys will be overwhelmed with the hospitality and the security which Pakistan has provided them for 20 years in the shelter, that they will do Pakistan's bidding. No, they're not going to do Pakistan's bidding. Despite anything and despite everything, they're not going to do. In fact, it's the other way around. Pakistan is now worried that the influence of the Taliban through the TTP is now extending up to, they're back in Swat, for example. Back into KPK, which is very close to Islamabad. So it is working in reverse.
So you would, as an Indian or, as an Indian or former bureaucrat, and now you're with the National Security Advisory Board, India is, of course, reaching out to the Taliban. We know that the embassy is reopened now, even if it's at a lower level. But you would say that India and the Taliban, because they're Pashtun and because India has a civilization, not only because they're Pashtun, but because India has a civilizational relationship with the people of Afghanistan, should encourage these efforts and should cement them and deepen them?
You see, it's a very complex question. What you said is right, but I also mentioned earlier civilizational links and so on and so forth. But I don't think so anybody in India or the government of India would accept what the Taliban are doing in terms of governance. Not an inclusive government, the treatment of women. And those are the kind of things that no government in India, because we are a democracy and because we have a value system, we believe in human rights, there's no government in India that can afford, will ever accept the Taliban for exactly who they are, unless and until there are massive changes. So it can be, one thing is you have a tactical relationship, you provided humanitarian aid, the people of Afghanistan, you continue to have a good relationship, you want to maintain that relationship with the Pashtuns, also with the Tajiks, Hazaras and Uzbeks. You want to maintain that relationship, but you cannot maintain that relationship in terms of diplomatic recognition and having a full-fledged mission over there till such time as the Taliban improve. This is what the rest of the world is also saying. I mean, the US has frozen their funds. The UN is not giving them a seat precisely for this reason.
Right.
And similarly for India, we are in a slightly more complex situation because of our civilizational links. But, we can't overlook what the Taliban governance. That's the important thing.
Absolutely. So 2 or 3 questions, Mr. Devasher. The first is, during our conversation, the Durand line has come up again and again. And you mentioned how Henry Mortimer Durand in 1993 sort of drew this line. And we know that in our subcontinent, all these Britishers are constantly drawing lines that separate our countries, Radcliffe line, then you have the McMahon line between India and China, and now you have the Durand line. So today, in today's Afghanistan, Pakistan, India triangle, what is the importance of the Durand line and what is India's position?
See, I'll come to India a bit later. The fact of the matter is the Durand line, when Mortimer Durand drew it up with the Amir Abdul Rahman, it demarcated spheres of influence.
Mhm.
The British writings and speeches and letters and address to Parliament, everything indicates that it was a sphere of influence. These areas, which are today called the federally administered tribal areas, where the Durand line east of it, the British never considered it as to be part of British India.
Mhm.
It was sphere of influence where the British would exert influence and exclude the influence of the Amir. Even in his own autobiography, the Amir says that he did not think that it was going to be handed over. It was in 1947 that, by a sleight of hand, the British changed spheres of influence into an international boundary.
Mhm.
And the reason for this was that the British Imperial Chiefs of Staff have a minuted, and this is mentioned in several books, that they found that their security and strategic interests could be met with Pakistan. And therefore, to strengthen Pakistan, they needed to ensure that its boundaries were stable and boundaries were secure. So I
Right.
mentioned in my Balochistan book that even initially, though the British had accepted the Kalat's independence, the Khan of Kalat independence in August 47, by October 47, they were telling Jinnah to absorb it because they realized that without Balochistan, Pakistan would be incomplete. Similarly, without having Fatah in what we call Pakistan, Pakistan would be incomplete. And later on, we could discuss this why a referendum had to be held. You know,
Mhm.
where Ghaffar Khan boycotted and talked about, raised the issue of Pashtunistan, because the British wanted Pakistan to consolidate itself so that they could use it for their aims against the Soviet Union.
Right.
Right, so that is one part of it. Now, you can go to the legalese of the Durand line, that how could Pakistan, the Afghans say, and rightly, that their treaty of the Durand line was signed with the British. How could it be handed over to a third country which did not even exist at that time?
Hmm.
There is also the issue of the duration of the Durand line, whether for 100 years, is it in perpetuity, or is it a temporary arrangement? But the really critical factor is, which Pakistan is aware of and is extremely worried, that ultimately in 1921, after the Third Afghan War, a treaty was signed between British India and Afghanistan called the Indo-Afghan frontier. You know, almost on the same line of the Durand line, but not fully. There were differences. But the critical portion of the treaty was that it was valid only for 3 years, and any of the two sides could repudiate the treaty after giving 1 year's notice without any questions asked.
Mhm.
Right? In 1949, there was a lower jirga that was called by the government of Afghanistan, and they repudiated the Durand Line, the 1921 treaty, the 1879 Gandamuk treaty, and they said we don't accept any of this. So as far as the Afghans are concerned, there is no boundary agreement then between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There is no. Therefore, no Afghan government since 1949 has accepted any boundary line with Pakistan. That is the reason why Pakistan has always insisted. It insisted with Rabbani and Masood. It insisted with Karzai. It insisted with Ghani. It insisted with the Taliban in the 90s 3 times to recognize the Durand line. It's insisting now with the Taliban again to recognize the Durand line. If Pakistan is so sure about the Durand line, this is what the international border is, why would they insist that the Afghans also accept it? Afghan is a weaker state, and you say, no, this is the line, and you fence it. But because they recognize they're in a weaker position, and they don't want any strong government in Kabul to raise the issue of the Durand line and raise revanchist demands on Pakistan, they keep insisting that any government in Kabul must recognize the Durand. And no government has, and I think no government in the future too will ever recognize the line. And ultimately, it's not the Durand line anymore; it's the Indo-Afghan frontier. If anything, you know, and because after 47, Pakistan has not renegotiated this or nor come to any agreement with any Afghan government on renegotiating the boundary.
But they are fencing, the Pakistanis are fencing it
Unilaterally.
within their territory, right?
Yeah. But no Afghan has accepted it. And the Taliban have the power to do something about it. Therefore, they have pulled down the fence in certain areas. In certain areas, they are firing and not allowing the Pakistanis to complete the fence. Because they feel that the issue is unresolved and it divides brothers. You know, it's on, you can't have this kind of a thing. So the Taliban are in a position to do something about it. That's why Pakistan is very worried.
And this is an assertion of the Pashtun identity.
Yes, because even now, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which we had mentioned earlier, initially everybody thought this was a religious-based organization wanting to implement Sharia. But of late, their statements have changed. They want their own identity and governance in the federally administered tribal areas. So they are also now asserting a nationalist sort of a narrative. Then we haven't talked about the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. This is a non-violent group, which has come up for the last 4 years due to the extrajudicial killing of the Pashtuns. And they want to assert their constitutional rights and not be treated as cannon fodder by the Afghan government. So it's a complex situation.
Pakistan government.
Yeah. You have got the PTA, which is Pashtun, you have got the TTP, which is Pashtun, you have got the Taliban, which are Pashtuns. And if somehow it seems difficult at the moment, they want to get around, have some sort of a modus vivendi. And then you have the mainstream political parties who are also Pashtuns. For example, the Awami National Party. You have the Pashtunkhwa Milli Awami Party of Mahmood Khan Achakzai and Asfandyar Wali Khan of the ANP. They are also talking about Pashtun rights, asserting Pashtun rights and the situation both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So very interesting dynamics are taking place. And in India, we don't hear too much about them, but we should pay a close attention. India has no direct role. I think we're just looking and observing and watching this change.
So India, if you can tell us very briefly about India's position on the Durand line.
No, I don't think that we have a position on the Durand.
Okay.
The reason simply is, if you do away the Durand line, then you have a large number of Pashtuns who come together. This is something which the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks don't look upon too favorably. Because as it is, they find that too many Pashtuns. If you get 31 million more Pashtuns, then they get further reduced into a minority. So, the Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks would rather let the situation be as it is, the status quo, and have whatever Pashtuns are there. So it's a complex dynamic.
So this so-called Pashtunistan, which could become, who knows, but between the Pashtuns of Afghanistan and of Pakistan, how many million people would there be?
So 31 plus 15, that's 46.
46. So that's a...
But there are, let me not put it so simply, there are many, many challenges because the Pashtuns in Pakistan are very well integrated into the system. They are serving army officers, senior army officers. A large percentage of the Pakistan army is Pashtun. They are integrated economically. The largest Pashtun city in the world is Karachi. It is not Peshawar, it is not Kabul, it's not Jalalabad or Kandahar for that matter. It is Karachi. So there are a lot of difficulties, in visualizing a Pashtunistan. But the fact is they continue to have a lot of commonality. So how this will play out, I don't know. Ultimately, I think the Pashtuns themselves have to articulate a vision and working with all. You can't have a polarized, as it is, the Pashtuns are polarized with the Taliban on one side. The rest of the Pashtuns may not accept what Talibans are doing or what Taliban are about. So there are major issues. It's not an easy construct.
So last couple of questions, Mr. Devasher. What is the relationship between the Pashtuns of Afghanistan and the Taliban? I'm sure that just because they're all Pashtun doesn't mean that it's all very happy and hunky-dory, right?
Yeah. So, see, not all Pashtuns are Taliban, but all Taliban are Pashtuns. Except for the little bit of Hazara, one Tajik they have, sort of a showpiece. So all Pashtuns don't accept the Taliban ideology of the Wahhabi. See, the Pashtuns over the centuries have been conservative Deobandis with a strong Sufi influence. Mm-hmm. Now, the Taliban have come across with a new religious kind of ideology, which the Pashtuns, other Pashtuns in Afghanistan and similarly in Pakistan do not accept. Mm-hmm. But because they're the dominant military force, most of the Pashtuns are keeping quiet about it. So it is a lot of tension in the relationship.
And
what the Pashtuns in Afghanistan feel is that once again Pashtun leadership has been asserted in Afghanistan, which they had lost during the time of Rabani and Masood, and even under Karzai and Ghani, the key ministries like defense and other, interior and all that were held by non-Pashtuns. So now they feel a sense of Pashtun assertion. So they are willing to bide their time or give Taliban space.
So this, but in a sense, I mean, in the modern world, this assertion or reassertion of your tribal identity rather than a national identity. I mean, that's a bit sort of weird, isn't it? So it's the Pashtuns versus the Tajiks or the Hazaras, while they should all be Afghan.
Yes. You see, it's again a very strange dynamic. The Pashtuns feel that Afghanistan is a Pashtun state. It's the only Pashtun state in the world. Yet, when you talk amongst themselves, the Afghan or the Pashtun may have a rivalry with the Tajik or the Uzbeks, but they all insist on being Afghan. Right? No Tajik will want to go and say that we want to merge with Tajikistan. Uzbek doesn't want to merge with Afghanistan. Likewise, similarly with the Pashtuns, they are very happy being Afghans. Yet they have their ethnic rivalry. It's complex. It's a lot of people will not say, what do it's shades of gray.
So between among the Pashtuns, I'm sure you have so many tribes. You talked about the Gilzais, the Karzai, the Duranis, and there are other tribes. So again, do they all sort of come together, or are there differences between the tribes? I'm sure some are in the hierarchy above others.
Yeah, there's a lot of inter-tribal rivalry which has been there throughout. As I mentioned, the rivalry between Duranis and Gilzais, or between the Masuds and the Vizirs. But within the Duranis also, there will be tribes, for example, the Kopalzais, which is Karzai's tribe. Then you have the Alikuzais, you have the Mohammedzais. There's intertribal rivalry, and within the tribe itself, you have rivalries between cousins, between brothers. The reason is that the Pashtun is probably the most individualistic person, because they all claim descent from a common ancestor, and they all believe they were converted by the Prophet himself. So each one feels that he is a king, and he's not willing to listen to the other person. So in the book, I quote Ghani Khan, who mentions this very well, that we are all rain-sown wheat. We all came up on the same day. So nobody will accept they're all equal. So the hierarchy is achieved. You're not born into a hierarchy. Khan's son will not become a Khan, but he has to achieve it.
Fascinating stuff, Mr. Devasher. I'd like to hold up the book again.
Thank you so much.
And all of you viewers, please go out and get a copy of the book by Tilak Devasher, The Pashtuns, A Contested History. And you're watching Softcover, which is the Print's digital online release. The book has been published by HarperCollins. Mr. Devasher, this has been a fascinating conversation. I could go on, and I'm sure that we will have the opportunity to talk to you about this and various other issues. It's really like a magnificent story, actually, in so many ways. But thank you so much for writing this book and for speaking to us at The Print.
Thank you so much. And let me tell you, show you, I have learned so much about the Pashtuns I didn't know of. Just as I learned so much about Pakistan, writing on Pakistan, I have learned so much about the Pashtun, and it was fascinating. And one thing, we didn't touch upon, which I could just mention. You see, the depiction of the Pashtun as a violent and warlike people is due to the colonial literature. 100 years of British contact, where they led over 100 expeditions against the Pashtuns, have brought about this, the writings of Churchill and all the other people. There are very few accounts what the Pashtuns have written about themselves or about the British. And one such has been by Ghani Khan, who is Ghaffar Khan's son. And his book, The Pathans, is absolutely a fascinating experience, reading about who the Pathan actually is, who the Pashtun actually is. So, we need to balance the overwhelming colonial painting of the Pashtuns as warlike. What the Pashtuns themselves think, very little of that. As Ghani Khan writes, that we have no written history, but we have thousands of stones who are thirsty to tell their tale, if only somebody would willing to listen to them. So I think Pashtuns are a fascinating people.
Absolutely. And as a journalist who's just come back from Kabul a few weeks ago, I can vouch for that and completely agree with everything you say. It's such a fascinating people, such a fascinating country. But like I said, thank you again for writing this book and for enhancing our knowledge of this tribe, this community. And thank you so much for speaking to The Print.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me over.